Deep in the Montana wilderness, 12-year-old Tommy Fletcher made a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about his mountain home. While tracking deer through thick pine forests, he stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist, an abandoned railroad cutting through terrain no train had crossed in decades. Rusted rails disappeared into overgrown tunnels, and forgotten train cars sat like sleeping giants among the trees. But this wasn't just another relic of the past. Fresh footprints in the mud, recently cleared brush, and the faint sound of metal on metal suggested someone was still using this ghost railroad. As Tommy followed the mysterious tracks deeper into the wilderness, he began to uncover a secret that connected his quiet mountain community to a dark chapter of history that some people would kill to keep buried. What was someone hiding in these forgotten tunnels, and why were they so determined to keep the old railroad alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tommy Fletcher had always been different from other 12-year-old boys in Pine Ridge, Montana. While his classmates spent their afternoons glued to video games or scrolling through their phones, Tommy preferred the ancient silence of the mountain forests that surrounded their small community. His grandfather, who had passed 3 years ago, had taught him to read the wilderness like other children read books. The morning after his discovery, Tommy sat at the kitchen table, picking at his scrambled eggs, his mind still spinning with images of rusted rails and abandoned train cars. His mother, Sarah Fletcher, noticed his distraction immediately. She had that particular gift that single mothers develop, an ability to sense when something occupied her child's thoughts. "You're awfully quiet this morning," she said, pouring herself a second cup of coffee. Sarah taught 3rd grade at Pine Ridge Elementary, the same school Tommy attended, though thankfully not in his grade. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to handle life's challenges alone. Tommy looked up from his eggs, his grandfather's hunting knife resting in its worn leather sheath on his belt. He never went into the woods without it. The knife had belonged to 3 generations of Fletcher men before him, its blade still sharp, its handle smoothed by decades of use. His grandfather had given it to him on his 10th birthday, along with the responsibility that came with it. "Just thinking about yesterday's hunt," Tommy said, which wasn't entirely a lie. He had been tracking deer when he stumbled upon the railroad, but the deer seemed insignificant now compared to what he had found. Sarah studied her son's face. Tommy had his father's eyes, dark brown and serious, often holding thoughts deeper than his years should allow. His father had died in military service when Tommy was 7, leaving behind a son who grew up faster than he should have, and a wife who never quite stopped listening for footsteps that would never come home. "Did you see anything interesting out there?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Tommy hesitated. The discovery felt too big, too important to share casually over breakfast. Besides, he wasn't even sure what he had found. An abandoned railroad could mean anything or nothing. Maybe it was just old logging equipment, though those tracks looked far too substantial for moving timber. "Found some new deer trails," he said instead. "Jake wants to come with me next time I go out." Jake Morrison lived 2 houses down from them in Pine Ridge's modest residential area. The Morrison family had moved to Montana from California 3 years ago, seeking what Jake's father called authentic mountain living. Jake had struggled at first, unused to the isolation and the different pace of life, but Tommy had taken him under his wing. Now Jake could track almost as well as Tommy, though he still complained about the early morning starts and the complete absence of cell phone signal in the deep woods. Sarah smiled. She liked Jake, appreciated how his friendship had helped Tommy open up more. Her son had always been solitary by nature, comfortable in his own company and the company of the wilderness. But boys his age needed friends, needed connections to the world beyond the trees. "That sounds nice. Just remember to be careful out there. And take the radio." She gestured to the small emergency radio that sat on the counter, the same one Tommy's grandfather had carried during his decades of hunting and exploring these mountains. After breakfast, Tommy gathered his gear methodically. His backpack contained the essentials his grandfather had taught him to carry: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, matches in a waterproof container, a small tarp, and 50 feet of paracord. He clipped the radio to his belt opposite the knife and headed out into the crisp morning air. Pine Ridge consisted of maybe 300 souls scattered across a valley that seemed carved specifically for their small community. The town had one general store, one gas station, a volunteer fire department, and the school where his mother taught. Most families had lived here for generations, their roots running as deep as the pines that gave the place its name. Tommy had always felt a deep connection to this place, to its history and its secrets. His grandfather had filled his childhood with stories about the early settlers, the mining boom that had briefly brought prosperity to the area, and the quiet decades that followed, when the mountains reclaimed their solitude. But yesterday's discovery suggested there were stories his grandfather had never told him, or perhaps had never known. As he walked toward Jake's house, Tommy's hand unconsciously touched the handle of his grandfather's knife. Whatever that railroad represented, whatever secrets it held, he was determined to uncover them. Some things, his grandfather had always said, were worth knowing regardless of the risks involved. Jake Morrison was still in his pajamas when Tommy knocked on the back door of the Morrison house. Through the kitchen window, Tommy could see Jake's mother making pancakes while his father read something on his tablet, probably checking the stock market before it opened. The Morrisons brought a piece of their California life with them wherever they went. "Tommy!" Jake's face lit up when he opened the door. "You're early. Want some pancakes?" "Already ate," Tommy said, though the smell of Mrs. Morrison's cooking made him reconsider. "We need to talk. Privately." Jake's expression shifted, recognizing the serious tone in his friend's voice. "Give me 5 minutes to get dressed." 10 minutes later, the two boys sat on an old log behind Jake's house, far enough from adult ears to speak freely. Tommy pulled out a piece of birch bark from his pocket, its surface covered with rough pencil markings that formed a crude map. "I found something yesterday," Tommy said, unfolding the bark carefully. "Something big." Jake leaned in, studying the hand-drawn lines and symbols. "What is this?" "Looks like a map." "It is a map of a railroad I found about 3 miles northeast of Copper Creek." Tommy traced the route with his finger. "Look, it runs from here, through this valley, and disappears into Miller's Canyon." "A railroad? Out there?" Jake's voice carried disbelief. "Tommy, there's no railroad in these mountains. Trust me, my dad researched all the infrastructure before we moved here. He was worried about noise." "That's what I thought too." Tommy refolded the bark map. "But it's there, Jake. Train cars, tracks, even a locomotive. All of it just sitting in the forest like someone parked a train and walked away." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. His scientific mind, inherited from his engineer father, wanted logical explanations. Maybe it's old logging equipment. They used to run narrow-gauge railroads to move timber. These aren't narrow-gauge tracks. They're full-size, heavy steel. And Jake, here's the weird part. Tommy lowered his voice even though they were alone. "Some of it looks maintained, like someone's been taking care of it." "What do you mean, maintained?" "Fresh oil on the rails, brush cleared away from the cars, and I found footprints, recent ones, in the mud around the locomotive." Tommy met his friend's eyes. "Someone's been out there, Jake, recently." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had grown up on adventure movies and mystery books, but real mysteries were different. They carried weight, consequences that fictional adventures never had. "We should tell someone," Jake said finally. "Your mom, or my parents, or maybe Sheriff Davidson." "Tell them what? That I found a secret railroad that doesn't exist on any map." "They'll think we're making it up." Tommy stood, brushing dirt off his jeans. "Besides, what if there's a reason it's secret? What if we're not supposed to find it? Then maybe we shouldn't go poking around." Tommy looked at his friend, understanding the fear he saw there. Jake had always been more cautious, more aware of potential consequences. It was one of the things that made their friendship work. Tommy's boldness balanced Jake's careful nature, while Jake's thoughtfulness kept Tommy from taking dangerous risks. "I'm going back," Tommy said quietly, "with or without you, but I'd rather have you with me." Jake sighed, knowing he was about to agree to something that would probably get them both in trouble. When? Today, this afternoon, we tell our parents we're going camping at Silver Lake, but we go to the railroad instead. Tommy pulled his backpack higher on his shoulders. I've got most of the gear we'll need. You just bring your sleeping bag and some food. Camping overnight? Tommy, my parents will freak if anything happens to us out there. Nothing's going to happen. We'll be careful. We'll just look around, take some pictures with your camera, and figure out what this thing is. Tommy's voice carried the kind of conviction that made it hard to argue with him. Think about it, Jake. When's the last time something really interesting happened in Pine Ridge? This could be the adventure we've been waiting for. Jake looked at the crude map one more time, then at his friend's determined face. Against his better judgment, he felt excitement beginning to override his caution. Okay, but we stick together, we don't touch anything that looks dangerous, and if things get weird, we leave immediately. Deal. Tommy grinned and extended his hand for a shake. Meet me at the trailhead to Copper Creek at 2 o'clock. And Jake, don't mention this to anyone else yet, not until we know what we're dealing with. As Tommy walked back toward his house, Jake remained sitting on the log, staring at where the map had been. He had the distinct feeling that their simple mountain life was about to become much more complicated. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine canopy as Tommy and Jake approached the hidden railroad for the second time. Jake's breathing was heavy from the 3-mile hike, his California upbringing still no match for Tommy's mountain-born endurance. They had told their parents they were camping at Silver Lake, a popular spot 2 miles in the opposite direction. The deception sat uneasily with both boys, but their curiosity outweighed their guilt. There, Tommy whispered, pointing through a gap in the trees. See the metal glinting in the sunlight? Jake stopped walking and stared. Even knowing what to expect, seeing the abandoned railroad cars sitting silently among the towering pines struck him as deeply surreal. Nature had begun its slow work of reclamation, with vines crawling up the sides of freight cars and saplings growing between the rails, but the trains looked far too intact for something truly abandoned. This is incredible, Jake breathed, pulling out his digital camera. How long do you think they've been here? Decades, maybe. But look at this. Tommy led Jake to the first freight car, a rust-red boxcar with faded lettering on its side. The doors stood slightly ajar, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Someone's been inside recently. The dust patterns are all wrong. Jake examined the entrance, his engineer father's analytical thinking starting to surface. You're right, and look at these hinges. They've been oiled. Abandoned equipment doesn't maintain itself. The boys exchanged glances before Tommy squeezed through the gap into the boxcar's interior. Jake followed reluctantly, his camera clutched protectively against his chest. Inside, shafts of sunlight illuminated a space that was surprisingly clean. The wooden floor showed wear patterns from recent foot traffic, and personal belongings sat arranged along one wall, as if someone had been living there. Tommy, look at this. Jake knelt beside a collection of items that included modern water bottles, energy bar wrappers, and a small camp stove. This stuff isn't old. Some of these energy bars don't even expire until next year. Tommy moved deeper into the car, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. At the far end, hanging from a nail driven into the wooden wall, was a railroad lantern that looked like it belonged in a museum. But when Tommy lifted it down and examined the base, he found a small switch. He flicked it, and warm yellow light filled the car. It works, he said, amazement clear in his voice. Jake, this lantern works. Someone's been maintaining it, probably changing the batteries. Jake took several photographs of the lantern, the living area, and the various personal items scattered around the car. Each image only deepened the mystery. Who would choose to live in an abandoned railroad car in the middle of nowhere? And more importantly, where were they now? The boys spent the next hour exploring 3 more cars. Each told a similar story of abandonment, followed by careful maintenance. In the caboose, they found a small library of books, all in excellent condition despite their age. Railroad manuals from the 1952 sat alongside more recent novels and technical journals. Someone with diverse interests had been spending significant time here. "Look at this," Jake called from near the locomotive. He stood beside the massive engine, pointing at a series of markings carved into the metal housing. The symbols looked deliberate, almost like a code or message, but neither boy could decipher their meaning. Tommy approached the markings, running his fingers over the carved lines. They had been made with precision, not the random scratches of vandalism or boredom. Someone wanted to leave a message. The question is, for who? As they documented everything with Jake's camera, both boys became increasingly aware of the sounds around them. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a distant branch seemed potentially significant. The feeling of being watched, which Tommy had experienced during his first visit, returned stronger than before. "We should probably set up camp before it gets dark," Jake said, though he sounded reluctant to spend the night so close to the mysterious railroad. They found a clearing about 100 yards from the tracks where they could pitch Jake's small tent while maintaining a clear view of the train cars. As they worked, Tommy kept the railroad lantern close by, its steady glow providing comfort against the gathering shadows. "Tomorrow we follow the tracks," Tommy said as they settled into their sleeping bags. "See where they lead." Jake nodded, though privately he wondered if they were getting in over their heads. The mystery was fascinating, but mysteries often came with dangers that weren't apparent until it was too late to back out. Still, looking at Tommy's determined expression in the lantern light, Jake knew there was no turning back now. The morning came quietly in the mountains, with mist rising from the forest floor and the distant call of a loon echoing across hidden lakes. Tommy woke first, as he always did, his internal clock tuned to the rhythms of the wilderness. Jake was still sleeping deeply, exhausted from their previous day's discoveries and the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. Tommy crawled out of the tent and walked softly toward the locomotive, drawn by an urge he couldn't quite explain. In the early morning light, the massive engine looked even more impressive and mysterious than it had the day before. The black metal gleamed with moisture from the night air, and Tommy could almost imagine it breathing like some sleeping giant. He climbed up into the cab, something he hadn't dared do with Jake watching. The controls were more complex than he had expected, with dozens of gauges, levers, and switches that spoke to the skill required to operate such a machine. But tucked into a small compartment behind the engineer's seat, Tommy found something that made his heart race. It was a leather journal, weathered but not ancient, its pages filled with handwritten entries in careful script. Tommy opened it carefully, aware that he was handling something precious and potentially dangerous. The first entry was dated just 3 months earlier. May 15th. Another group of hikers came close to the site today, had to move deeper into the tunnel system until they passed. The secrecy gets harder to maintain each year, but the promise I made to Catherine still holds. Her father's work must remain protected until the right time comes. Tommy flipped through several pages, his excitement growing with each entry. Here was proof that someone was actively using the railroad, someone who knew its history and felt bound to protect it. The entries spoke of Catherine's father and the work, with a reverence that suggested something far more significant than abandoned mining equipment. June 3rd found evidence that the government people have been checking the perimeter again. Tire tracks near the old access road, cigarette butts that weren't there last week. They promised to leave the site alone after the agreement in '75, but promises from government men aren't worth much. We'll need to be more careful. Jake's voice calling his name broke Tommy's concentration. He carefully closed the journal and slipped it into his jacket pocket, knowing instinctively that this discovery was too important to share immediately. Some things needed time to be properly understood. "Over here," Tommy called back, climbing down from the locomotive cab, just looking at the engine. Jake emerged from the tent looking rumpled and slightly disoriented. "Man, sleeping on the ground is harder than it looks in movies. My back feels like I've been wrestling bears." Despite his friend's discomfort, Tommy could see the excitement in Jake's eyes. The mystery of the railroad had captured his imagination just as thoroughly as it had Tommy's. They ate a quick breakfast of energy bars and trail mix while planning their exploration of the tracks. "According to my compass, the rails head northeast from here," Tommy said, pointing along the line of steel that disappeared into the forest. "If we follow them for a couple miles, we should get a better sense of where this railroad was supposed to go." The walk along the tracks proved more difficult than either boy had anticipated. Decades of forest growth had created obstacles that required constant detours and careful navigation. Fallen trees blocked the path in several places, and thick underbrush made walking directly on the rails impossible for long stretches. But after nearly 2 hours of hiking, they found something that stopped them both in their tracks. The railroad entered a tunnel, carved directly into the side of a mountain. The entrance was partially concealed by hanging vines and accumulated debris, but the tunnel itself appeared to be in remarkably good condition. "A tunnel," Jake whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever secrets lay hidden in the darkness beyond. "Tommy, this railroad goes through the mountain." Tommy approached the tunnel entrance carefully, using his flashlight to peer into the blackness beyond. The beam revealed steel rails disappearing into shadows and walls that showed clear evidence of professional engineering and construction. This wasn't some amateur mining operation. Someone had invested serious money and expertise in building this railroad. "We need better equipment if we're going to explore that tunnel," Jake said, his voice carrying both excitement and apprehension. "Rope, more flashlights, maybe some way to mark our path so we don't get lost." Tommy nodded, but his hand unconsciously touched the journal hidden in his jacket. Based on what he had read that morning, they weren't the only ones interested in what lay beyond that tunnel entrance. The question was whether the other interested parties would welcome their curiosity or see it as a threat to secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. The Pine Ridge Library occupied a corner of the town's community center, its collection modest but carefully maintained by Mrs. Henderson, who had served as the town's librarian for nearly 40 years. Tommy and Jake pushed through the heavy wooden doors that afternoon, their backpacks still dusty from their morning hike back from the railroad site. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her desk, where she was cataloging new acquisitions, her sharp eyes immediately focusing on the two boys. At 63, she had developed an uncanny ability to sense when children were up to something that might require adult intervention. "Well, if it isn't our local explorers," she said, setting down her pen. "What brings you boys to the library on such a beautiful Saturday afternoon? Shouldn't you be outside getting into the kind of trouble that builds character?" Tommy approached her desk with what he hoped was casual confidence. "We're working on a school project about local history, specifically about transportation and how people moved goods through these mountains in the old days." "Transportation, is it?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite specific. What grade of school project requires such detailed historical research?" Jake jumped in, hoping to support Tommy's story. "It's for extra credit. My dad says understanding infrastructure development is important for understanding how communities grow." Mrs. Henderson studied both boys for a long moment, her expression suggesting she wasn't entirely convinced by their explanation, but she stood and gestured toward a section of shelves near the back of the library. "Well then, you'll want to start with our local history collection. We have newspaper archives going back to the 1922, some mining company records, and a few oral history projects that students have done over the years." The boys spent the next hour poring over dusty volumes and newspaper microfilm, searching for any mention of railroad activity in their area. Most of what they found related to the logging industry and the brief copper mining boom of the 1942. But buried in a 1952 edition of the Pine Ridge Weekly, Tommy found something that made his pulse quicken. The headline read, "Local Railroad Ceases Operations Suddenly." The article was brief, almost suspiciously so, mentioning only that the Pine Ridge Mountain Railway has suspended all operations, effective immediately, due to changes in federal transportation requirements. No explanation of what those requirements were, no mention of what the railroad had been transporting, and no details about what would happen to the infrastructure. "Mrs. Henderson," Tommy called, holding up the newspaper copy. "Do you remember anything about this railroad, the Pine Ridge Mountain Railway?" The librarian approached their table and looked at the article, her expression growing noticeably more guarded. "That was before my time working here, dear. I was just a girl when that happened." But surely people in town talked about it. A whole railroad just shutting down overnight seems like it would be big news in a place this size. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing her words carefully. Some things that happened back then, well, people learned not to ask too many questions. It was a different time, with the Cold War and all the government secrets. Folks understood that some information was better left alone. Jake looked up from a map he had been studying. Government secrets? What would the government want with a railroad in the middle of nowhere? I really couldn't say, Mrs. Henderson replied, but her tone suggested she could say more if she chose to. Perhaps you boys should focus your research on topics that have more available documentation. The mining history is quite fascinating, and there are plenty of people still alive who worked those operations. Tommy carefully folded the newspaper copy and slipped it into his pocket. Actually, Mrs. Henderson, are there any people in town who might have worked on that railroad? Someone we could interview for our project? The librarian's expression grew even more cautious. Now, boys, I don't think it's appropriate for you to be bothering elderly residents with questions about things that happened so long ago. Some memories are better left undisturbed. But as she turned to walk away, she paused and spoke without looking back at them. Though if you were determined to speak with someone, Frank Kowalski worked for the railroad briefly before it closed. He lives in the Blue House on Maple Street, but I strongly suggest you leave well enough alone. After Mrs. Henderson returned to her desk, Tommy and Jake exchanged glances filled with excitement and apprehension. They had found their first real lead, but it came with clear warnings about the dangers of digging too deeply into the past. Frank Kowalski, Jake whispered. Think he'd talk to us? Tommy touched the journal hidden in his jacket, thinking about the entries that mentioned government interference and promises that weren't kept. Only one way to find out, but we need to be careful about how we approach him. If Mrs. Henderson is this nervous about the subject, there's definitely something important being hidden. Frank Kowalski's house sat at the end of Maple Street like a fortress of solitude, its blue paint faded but well-maintained, surrounded by a garden that spoke of decades of careful tending. Tommy and Jake stood at the front gate for several minutes, gathering courage to approach a man who might hold answers to questions that apparently made adults uncomfortable. The front door opened before they could knock, revealing a tall, lean man in his 70s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Frank Kowalski had the bearing of someone accustomed to hard work and harder decisions. "You boys have been standing at my gate for 10 minutes, he said, his voice carrying the trace of an accent that spoke of Eastern European origins. Either you're planning to rob me, or you want something that requires more courage than you currently possess." Tommy stepped forward, deciding that directness might serve them better than elaborate explanations. "Mr. Kowalski, we're Tommy Fletcher and Jake Morrison. We'd like to ask you about the old railroad, if you're willing to talk about it." Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Railroad? What railroad would that be, young man?" "The Pine Ridge Mountain Railway. We found a newspaper article from 1952 that said you worked there before it shut down." For a long moment, Frank studied both boys with the intensity of someone making an important decision. Finally, he stepped back and gestured for them to enter his house. The living room was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with photographs on the mantelpiece showing Frank as a younger man in various work settings. One photo showed him standing beside a locomotive, wearing overalls and a railroad worker's cap, his arm around a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "That's my Catherine," Frank said, noticing Tommy's gaze. "Lost her to cancer 15 years ago. She was the one who convinced me to keep quiet about certain things. Said some secrets are worth carrying to protect people you love." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Kowalski, we're not trying to cause trouble. We just found something in the woods, and we're trying to understand what it means." Frank walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room and withdrew a small metal object, turning it over in his weathered hands. It was a Railroad Workers' Union badge, its surface worn smooth but still clearly readable. "I worked that railroad for 18 months, Frank said, settling into his armchair. "Best job I ever had, and the most dangerous thing I ever kept quiet about." He handed the badge to Tommy. "That badge meant something once. meant I was part of an operation that couldn't be discussed with wives, friends, or even other railroad workers. Tommy examined the badge carefully, feeling the weight of decades of hidden history in his hands. What kind of operation? Frank was quiet for several minutes, staring at the photograph of his wife. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held burdens. Government work, Cold War stuff that young people like you probably read about in history books now. But in 1951 and 52, it was deadly serious business. He paused, seeming to weigh each word. We moved things through these mountains that couldn't be moved on regular railways, things that needed to stay invisible to certain interested parties. What kind of things? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know. The kind of things that could change the balance of power if they fell into the wrong hands. Scientists, equipment, documents, people whose work was so important that their location had to remain completely secret, even from other government agencies. Frank stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had held these secrets for 70 years. The railroad wasn't abandoned when it shut down, boys. It was sealed, hidden, protected, and there are people whose job it is to make sure it stays that way. Tommy felt the journal in his jacket pocket growing heavier with each revelation. Mr. Kowalski, are there still people watching the railroad site? Frank turned back to face them, his expression now openly concerned. Why do you ask that question, Tommy Fletcher? The use of his full name caught Tommy off guard. How do you know my last name? Because I knew your father, Frank said quietly. Michael Fletcher was one of the security team members assigned to protect the railroad after the official closure. He died keeping those secrets safe. Frank's eyes moved between both boys. Now tell me exactly what you found out there, and don't leave anything out. Your lives might depend on complete honesty. The weight of family history and hidden dangers suddenly pressed down on Tommy's shoulders. Everything was connected in ways he had never imagined, and the simple adventure he had envisioned was becoming something far more serious and potentially deadly. Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he pulled the leather journal from his jacket pocket and placed it on Frank's coffee table. The revelation about his father had shaken him more deeply than he wanted to admit, opening questions about family history that he had never thought to ask. I found this in the locomotive cab, Tommy said quietly. Someone's been writing in it recently, someone who talks about protecting Catherine's father's work. Frank's face went pale as he recognized the journal. He reached for it with hands that suddenly seemed older, more fragile. Where exactly did you find this, son? Hidden in a compartment behind the engineer's seat, there are entries from just a few months ago. Tommy watched Frank's expression carefully. The person writing in it mentions Catherine. Was that your wife? Frank opened the journal carefully, his eyes scanning entries that clearly held deep meaning for him. After several minutes, he looked up at both boys with an expression that mixed sorrow with something approaching relief. Catherine's father was Dr. Samuel Morrison, one of the leading nuclear physicists in the country during the early Cold War. He developed techniques for processing certain radioactive materials that were crucial to national defense. Frank's voice grew quieter. The railroad was built specifically to transport him and his equipment to a secret laboratory hidden in these mountains. Jake nearly choked on the water he had been drinking. Morrison? That's my last name. Are you saying we might be related? It's possible, Frank said, studying Jake's face with new interest. Dr. Morrison had family in California. When the project ended, some of them relocated there for safety reasons. He returned his attention to the journal. This handwriting belongs to someone I hoped I'd never see again, someone who was supposed to have left these mountains decades ago. Tommy leaned forward in his chair. Who is it? Frank stood and walked to his fireplace, where he retrieved a manila folder that had been hidden behind a row of books. Inside were documents that looked official and important, their edges yellowed with age, but their text still clearly readable. These are classified documents that your father asked me to keep safe, Frank said, handing Tommy a paper with government letterheads and official seals. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should give them to you when you were old enough to understand their importance. The document was partially burned along one edge, but Tommy could make out enough text to understand its significance. It detailed something called Project Mountain Shadow, a classified operation involving the transportation and protection of nuclear research materials through remote railroad lines in Montana. The person writing in that journal is Dr. Morrison's assistant, a man named Edward Chen, Frank continued. He was supposed to relocate to Los Alamos after the project ended, but he refused to leave, said someone needed to stay and protect the doctor's final research. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. Final research? What happened to Dr. Morrison? He died in 1954, 2 years after the railroad officially closed. Natural causes, but his death left behind decades of research that some people would kill to obtain. Frank sat back down heavily. Edward Chen has been living in those mountains ever since, maintaining the railroad cars, protecting the hidden laboratory, and keeping vigil over secrets that could still destabilize international relations. Tommy studied the burned document, noting references to foreign agents and security protocols that painted a picture of danger far beyond anything he had imagined. Mr. Kowalski, if this man Chen is still out there, why hasn't the government done something about it? Because officially, Project Mountain Shadow never existed. The government can't acknowledge Chen without acknowledging the project, and acknowledging the project would expose operations that are still classified 70 years later. Frank's expression grew grave. But there are unofficial watchers, people who keep track of Chen's activities and make sure he doesn't become a security risk. Like my father, like your father, and like others who have taken on that responsibility since his death. Frank closed the journal carefully. The problem is, boys, that foreign governments have never stopped being interested in Dr. Morrison's research. There are people who would pay enormous sums to get their hands on his final work, and your discovery of that railroad site may have attracted exactly the kind of attention we've been trying to avoid. The room fell silent as the full implications of their situation became clear. What had started as a simple adventure had evolved into something involving international security, family secrets, and dangers that neither boy was prepared to handle. "What do we do now?" Jake asked finally. Frank looked at both boys for a long moment, then reached for his telephone. "Now we make some calls to people who need to know that the secret is out. And we pray that we're not already too late to prevent the kind of trouble that your father died trying to stop." 3 days after their conversation with Frank Kowalski, Tommy decided to return to the railroad site alone. Jake had come down with a stomach flu that kept him bedridden, and Tommy's restlessness had grown unbearable. The weight of family secrets and international conspiracies felt too heavy to carry without taking some kind of action. He told his mother he was going fishing at Copper Creek, a half-truth that made the deception easier to bear. The hiking trail to the creek passed within a mile of the railroad site, close enough to make his story plausible if anyone asked questions later. The forest seemed different this time, more watchful somehow. Every sound carried potential meaning. Every shadow might conceal someone who didn't want to be seen. Tommy moved more carefully than usual, using techniques his grandfather had taught him for approaching wary game animals. When he reached the edge of the clearing where the train cars sat, Tommy froze. Something was wrong. The subtle signs of human presence that he had learned to read were all pointing in the wrong directions. Footprints in the soft earth showed recent activity, but they weren't from Edward Chen's worn boots. These were made by modern hiking shoes, possibly military-style boots. Tommy crept closer to the locomotive, staying low and using the underbrush for cover. As he approached the cab where he had found the journal, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A small device, roughly the size of a deck of cards, was attached to a tree about 20 feet from the tracks. Its black surface was broken by a tiny red light that blinked at regular intervals. A surveillance camera. Tommy's mind raced as he scanned the surrounding area with new eyes. How many other cameras were hidden among the trees? How long had they been there? Most importantly, who was watching the feeds? He carefully backed away from the camera's field of view and circled around to approach the train cars from a different angle. His grandfather's lessons about moving unseen through the forest had never felt more important. Every step had to be deliberate, every movement calculated to avoid detection. Near the caboose, Tommy found evidence of a more disturbing presence. Cigarette butts that were clearly fresh, probably no more than a day old. a small area where someone had sat for an extended period, watching the railroad cars. Most concerning of all, tire tracks leading to a concealed position where a vehicle could observe the site without being seen from the main trail. Someone was conducting surveillance on the railroad, and it wasn't Edward Chen. Tommy's hands shook slightly as he realized the implications. Frank's warnings about foreign interest in Dr. Morrison's research were apparently more current than anyone had realized. The question was whether these watchers were government agents protecting the site or foreign operatives planning something more sinister. He was about to retreat when he heard the distant sound of an engine approaching along the hidden access road. Tommy dove behind a fallen log and pressed himself flat against the forest floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. Two men emerged from a dark SUV that had been modified for off-road travel. They moved with the precision of trained professionals, checking equipment and communicating through small radio devices. Both wore civilian clothes, but their bearing and coordination suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. "Perimeter sensors show movement in Sector 7, one of them said into his radio. "Probably just wildlife, but we're checking it out." "Copy that," came the reply through the device. "Chen's been more active lately. Might be getting nervous about something." Tommy remained motionless as the men conducted a systematic sweep of the area. They checked the surveillance cameras, replaced batteries in hidden sensors, and took digital photographs of anything that looked disturbed. Their professional efficiency was both impressive and terrifying. "Kid's been here recently," the second man observed, kneeling beside the tracks where Tommy and Jake had walked 3 days earlier. "Boot prints don't match Chen's pattern. Someone else knows about this place." "Local kid, probably. We'll need to run facial recognition on the camera footage, see if we can identify him." The first man's voice carried a note of concern. "If word is getting out about this site, we may need to accelerate the timeline." "What timeline?" Tommy wondered silently, but he didn't have long to speculate. The men were moving in his direction, following the faint trail he had left approaching the log where he now hid. Tommy closed his eyes and tried to become one with the forest floor, using every trick his grandfather had taught him about remaining invisible to searchers. His life might depend on how well he had learned those lessons, because something told him these men wouldn't simply escort him home with a warning to stay away from dangerous places. The footsteps came closer, and Tommy held his breath, knowing that discovery would change everything in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Sarah Fletcher was grading papers at the kitchen table when Tommy burst through the front door, his face flushed and his breathing heavy from running the entire way home. She looked up from her red pen corrections to see her son's eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Mom, we need to talk," Tommy said, dropping his backpack and fishing gear by the door. "It's about Dad." Sarah set down her pen carefully, recognizing the tone in her son's voice that meant their conversation was about to venture into territory she had hoped to avoid for several more years. "What about your father, Tommy?" Tommy pulled out the classified document that Frank Kowalski had given him, placing it on the table beside her stack of third-grade math tests. The contrast between the innocent homework and the government papers marked with official seals was jarring. "Frank Kowalski told me Dad was part of something called Project Mountain Shadow, that he died protecting government secrets." Tommy's voice carried hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sarah stared at the document for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions that Tommy had never seen before. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a sadness that seemed to reach back through years of carefully maintained silence. "Because I promised him I wouldn't," she said quietly. "Your father made me swear that if anything happened to him, I would let you grow up without the weight of his secrets. He wanted you to have a normal childhood." She stood and walked to a cabinet that Tommy had always assumed contained only household papers and tax records. From behind a stack of insurance documents, she withdrew a small wooden box that he had never seen before. "These belong to your father," Sarah said, opening the box to reveal a pair of military dog tags, several photographs, and what looked like official identification cards. "He wasn't just regular army, Tommy. He was part of a special unit that handled classified security operations." Tommy picked up the dog tags, running his fingers over the embossed letters that spelled out his father's name and service number. Below the standard information was a code designation that meant nothing to him but clearly carried significance for his mother. Michael Fletcher, Security Clearance Level 7, Project Mountain Shadow. Sarah read from one of the identification cards. He was assigned to protect a classified research facility hidden somewhere in these mountains. The official story was that he died in a training accident, but the truth is more complicated. One of the photographs showed Tommy's father in military uniform standing beside another man in civilian clothes. The civilian looked familiar, and Tommy realized with a start that it might be a younger version of Edward Chen, the man Frank had described as Dr. Morrison's assistant. "Mom, there are people watching the railroad site right now, professional people with surveillance equipment and military training." Tommy's voice rose with urgency. "I think Dad's secrets are still dangerous to someone." Sarah closed the box carefully and sat back down at the table. "Your father always said this day might come, that someone would eventually discover the site and start asking questions." She looked directly at Tommy. He left instructions about what to do if that happened. She reached for the telephone, but Tommy caught her hand. "Mom, before you make any calls, there's something else you need to know. Jake Morrison might be related to the scientist who worked at that hidden laboratory. Dr. Morrison had family in California." Sarah paused, processing this information. That would explain why they moved here. Sometimes families of people involved in classified projects are relocated for their own protection. She dialed a number from memory. "Frank, it's Sarah Fletcher. Tommy found the railroad, and there are signs that others have too." "Yes, I think it's time." While his mother spoke in coded phrases that suggested years of preparation for this moment, Tommy examined his father's belongings more carefully. Hidden beneath the photographs was a folded piece of paper with what appeared to be a map of the local mountain area. Several locations were marked with symbols that Tommy didn't recognize, but one of them corresponded exactly to where he had found the abandoned railroad. "Your father spent the last 3 years of his life preparing contingency plans," Sarah said after ending her call. "Plans for protecting the research site if it was ever discovered or threatened." She pointed to the map. "These other locations are safe houses, supply caches, and communication points. He built a network to defend Dr. Morrison's work even after his own death." Tommy felt the weight of inheritance settling on his shoulders, not of property or money, but of responsibility that stretched back through decades of family sacrifice. "What happens now?" "Now we honor the promise your father made to protect something bigger than our family," Sarah said, standing and moving toward their gun cabinet. "And we hope that 12 years of peaceful quiet has prepared us well enough for what's coming." The confrontation came at dawn, just as the morning mist was beginning to rise from the forest floor. Tommy and Sarah had spent the night at one of the safe houses marked on his father's map, a small cabin hidden in a grove of aspens about 2 miles from the railroad site. Frank Kowalski had joined them after midnight, bringing weapons and communication equipment that had been stored for this exact scenario. Tommy woke to the sound of vehicles approaching along the access road, their engines muffled but unmistakable to ears trained by years of mountain living. Through the cabin's single window, he could see 3 black SUVs moving in formation, their occupants clearly professional and well-equipped. "Government or foreign?" Frank whispered, checking the action on a rifle that looked like it had seen military service. "About to find out," Sarah replied, speaking into a handheld radio. "Agent Martinez, this is Sarah Fletcher. We have multiple vehicles approaching the secondary site. Please confirm your people's location." The radio crackled with static before a clear voice responded. "Mrs. Fletcher, we have no personnel in your area. Repeat, no friendly forces near your position. Consider all approaching parties hostile." Tommy felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. The men approaching their position weren't the government agents who had been watching the railroad site. They were someone else entirely, someone with enough resources and determination to mount what looked like a military-style operation in the remote Montana wilderness. Through the trees, Tommy could see figures deploying from the vehicles with the efficiency of trained soldiers. They wore dark clothing and carried assault rifles, moving in coordinated teams that spoke of extensive tactical training. Whoever these people were, they hadn't come to ask polite questions about local history. "Frank," Sarah said quietly, "take Tommy to the emergency cache point. I'll try to buy you time to get the communications equipment to Agent Martinez." "Mom, I'm not leaving you here alone." "Yes, you are." Sarah said firmly, handing Tommy a backpack that contained his father's documents and the emergency radio. Your father died protecting this secret. I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless because we were too stubborn to follow the evacuation protocols he designed. Frank placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Son, your mother is right. The most important thing now is getting word to the people who can stop this from becoming an international incident. Through the window, they could see the armed figures spreading out to surround the cabin. Professional hand signals passed between team leaders as they established overlapping fields of fire and prepared for what appeared to be a coordinated assault. They know we're here, Frank observed, studying the enemy positions through binoculars. Someone gave them very detailed intelligence about this location. Sarah checked her own weapon, a pistol that she handled with the competence of someone who had received thorough training, which means they know about the other safe house locations too. We're dealing with people who have access to classified information about your father's network. One of the approaching soldiers stepped forward and called out in accented English, Mrs. Fletcher, we know you are inside. We have no wish to harm you or your son. We only want the research materials that belong to our government. What government? Sarah called back. The government that originally funded Dr. Morrison's research before your country stole it, came the reply. We are here to reclaim property that was taken from us illegally. Tommy looked at Frank in confusion. What's he talking about? Cold War politics, Frank said grimly. Dr. Morrison probably worked with international scientists before the project became classified. Someone's been waiting 70 years to get their hands on his final research. Sarah made her decision quickly. Frank, take Tommy out the back, follow the creek bed to the emergency cache, then get to Agent Martinez. I'll hold them here as long as possible. But before anyone could move, Tommy spotted something that changed everything. One of the assault team members had removed his helmet, revealing a face that Tommy recognized from the photographs in his father's collection. That's Edward Chen, Tommy whispered. The man who's been protecting the railroad site all these years. He's working with them. The betrayal hit Frank like a physical blow. Edward's been playing both sides. All these decades, he's been waiting for the right moment to sell out Dr. Morrison's research to the highest bidder. The sound of breaking glass announced that their time for planning had run out. The assault team was breaching the cabin, and the final confrontation that Tommy's father had prepared for was finally beginning. The escape through the cabin's rear window led Tommy and Frank into a nightmare of pursuit through terrain that Tommy knew better than anyone alive. Behind them, gunfire erupted as Sarah engaged the assault team, buying them precious minutes to reach the emergency cache point that Tommy's father had established years earlier. Frank moved surprisingly well for a man in his 70s, his old railroad workers' conditioning serving him well as they navigated fallen logs and steep ravines. Tommy led the way, using game trails and hidden paths that his grandfather had shown him, routes that wouldn't appear on any map or satellite image. There, Tommy pointed to a cluster of boulders that looked natural but concealed a carefully constructed hiding place. Dad's emergency cache. Inside the hidden compartment, they found exactly what Michael Fletcher had promised would be there. Military-grade communication equipment, weapons, medical supplies, and most importantly, a foreign communication device that looked distinctly different from American equipment. Frank examined the device carefully, his expression growing darker as he recognized its significance. This is Russian military hardware, probably from the 1982nd. Your father must have captured it during one of his operations. Tommy activated the emergency radio and tuned it to the frequency that Agent Martinez had provided. Agent Martinez, this is Tommy Fletcher. We're at Cache Point 7. My mother is under attack by foreign operatives who have been planning this for decades. The response came immediately. Tommy, this is Martinez. We're tracking multiple aircraft approaching your position. I need you to activate the beacon in that cache so we can coordinate a rescue operation. As Tommy searched for the beacon device, Frank continued examining the foreign communication equipment. Tommy, this radio is still receiving transmissions. Someone's been using it to monitor government communications about the railroad site. The intercepted messages painted a picture of careful planning that stretched back months. Foreign intelligence services had been tracking Edward Chen's activities, waiting for the right moment to approach him with an offer he couldn't refuse. The promise of reuniting with family members who had been trapped behind the Iron Curtain for decades had finally convinced him to betray the trust that Dr. Morrison had placed in him. "Agent Martinez," Tommy spoke into the radio again, "Edward Chen has been feeding intelligence to foreign operatives. They know about all of Dad's security measures." "Copy that, Tommy. We've suspected Chen for months, but we needed proof of his betrayal before we could act." Martinez's voice carried the tension of someone coordinating multiple operations simultaneously. "The research facility has been compromised. We're implementing the final security protocol that your father designed." Through the trees, Tommy could hear the sound of helicopters approaching, but whether they carried rescue or additional threats remained unclear. Frank handed him a pair of binoculars, and Tommy focused on the aircraft that were converging on their position. "Government markings," Tommy reported, "but there are also civilian helicopters that don't match our equipment." The foreign communication device suddenly crackled to life, with transmissions in what sounded like Russian. Frank's face went pale as he listened to the exchange. "They're not just after Dr. Morrison's research," Frank translated. "They're planning to destroy the entire facility to prevent anyone else from accessing it. This was never about stealing the technology. It's about making sure America loses it permanently." The implications hit Tommy like a physical blow. 70 years of his family's sacrifice, generations of secrets carefully protected, were about to be wiped out in a single operation designed to cripple American nuclear research capabilities. "We have to warn Agent Martinez," Tommy said, reaching for the radio. But before he could transmit, the hidden cache was suddenly illuminated by spotlights from above. One of the foreign helicopters had found their position, and armed figures were already rappelling down ropes toward their hiding place. "Tommy," Frank said urgently, pressing something into the boy's hand, "take this and run. Get to the railroad site and find the real research facility. Your father's map shows a hidden entrance that even Chen doesn't know about." Tommy looked down to see a small electronic device that pulsed with a steady red light. "What is this?" "A dead man's switch," Frank said grimly, revealing explosives that he had been carrying in his pack. "If they want to destroy Dr. Morrison's work, they'll have to go through me first. But you need to make sure the right people get access to that research before it's too late." The sound of boots hitting the ground around their position meant that Tommy's time for questions had run out. Frank pushed him toward a concealed exit that led deeper into the forest, toward a confrontation with secrets that had been buried for decades and enemies who had been planning this moment for longer than Tommy had been alive. As he ran through the darkness, Tommy could hear Frank's voice calling out a final challenge to their pursuers, buying time with the same courage that had motivated his father's sacrifice years earlier. Tommy ran through the forest with Frank's final words echoing in his mind, the dead man's switch device clutched tightly in his hand. Behind him, the sound of explosions confirmed that Frank had made good on his promise to buy time. But it also meant that Tommy was now completely alone in a situation that had escalated far beyond anything his 12-year-old mind had been prepared to handle. The emergency radio system that Frank had given him crackled to life as he reached the ridge overlooking the railroad site. Agent Martinez's voice came through clearly despite the chaos erupting across the mountainside. "Tommy, this is Agent Martinez. Frank Kowalski's sacrifice has given us the window we needed. Foreign aircraft are retreating, but we have intelligence suggesting they've planted explosives at the research facility. You're the only person close enough to prevent total destruction of 70 years of classified research." Tommy pressed the transmit button, his voice shaking slightly from exertion and fear. "Agent Martinez, I don't know where the real research facility is. Frank said there was a hidden entrance that even Edward Chen doesn't know about. Your father's map should show a secondary tunnel system that connects to the main laboratory. Look for markings that indicate a ventilation shaft about half a mile northwest of the locomotive." Tommy pulled out his father's map, studying the symbols and notations that had seemed like random marks just days earlier. Now, with his new understanding of the situation, the markings began to make sense. One symbol, repeated in several locations, appeared to indicate underground passages that connected various points around the railroad site. As he approached the area that Agent Martinez had described, Tommy could hear the sound of helicopters circling overhead and voices calling out in multiple languages. The foreign operatives hadn't given up their mission, even after Frank's explosive resistance had cost them several team members. The ventilation shaft was hidden beneath a camouflaged grate that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood both engineering and the importance of absolute secrecy. Tommy used his grandfather's hunting knife to pry open the access panel, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. "Agent Martinez, I found the entrance," Tommy reported. "It's a vertical shaft that goes down maybe 50 feet. Tommy, listen carefully. The research facility contains materials that are still dangerous after 70 years. You need to locate Dr. Morrison's final research notes and get them to the surface before the foreign operatives can detonate their explosives." The climb down was terrifying in ways that Tommy's mountain adventures had never prepared him for. This wasn't natural cave exploration or familiar forest terrain. This was a man-made facility built for purposes that involved national security and scientific research that could still affect global politics decades after its creation. At the bottom of the shaft, Tommy found himself in a tunnel system that extended in multiple directions. Emergency lighting, apparently triggered by his presence, illuminated corridors lined with equipment that looked both ancient and incredibly sophisticated. Dr. Morrison's hidden laboratory was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Following signs marked in English and what appeared to be Russian, Tommy made his way toward the central research area. The dual language markers suggested that Dr. Morrison's work had involved international cooperation that was later classified and hidden when political relationships changed. In the main laboratory, Tommy found something that took his breath away. Banks of computers and scientific equipment sat alongside research materials that were clearly still active. Dr. Morrison's work hadn't ended in 1954. Someone had been continuing his research for decades, maintaining and expanding on discoveries that the outside world believed had been abandoned. A journal, much newer than the one he had found in the locomotive, lay open on the central workstation. The handwriting was different from Edward Chen's, suggesting that yet another person had been involved in protecting and advancing Dr. Morrison's work. Day 7847, since Project Mountain Shadow officially ended, the most recent entry read, "The research continues to yield results that could revolutionize energy production, but the political implications remain too dangerous for public revelation. Chen's recent contact with foreign agents means the facility must be relocated immediately." Tommy heard footsteps in the tunnel behind him and realized that his time was running out. The foreign operatives had found the hidden entrance, and they were approaching the laboratory with the same professional efficiency they had demonstrated at the safe house. He grabbed the research journal and as many of the computer storage devices as he could carry, then activated the emergency radio one final time. "Agent Martinez, I'm in the facility, and I have the research materials, but the bad guys are here too, and I don't think I can get out the way I came in." The response came immediately, along with instructions that would test every survival skill Tommy had learned from his grandfather and every bit of courage he had inherited from his father. The explosion that rocked the underground facility sent Tommy sprawling across the laboratory floor, his ears ringing from the concussion and debris raining down from the ceiling. The foreign operatives had begun their demolition sequence, but their timing device had malfunctioned, detonating earlier than planned and trapping both Tommy and his pursuers in the collapsing tunnel system. Emergency lighting flickered as backup power systems struggled to maintain illumination in the damaged facility. Tommy could hear voices shouting in Russian somewhere behind him, but the main tunnel he had used to enter the laboratory was now blocked by fallen concrete and twisted metal. "Agent Martinez," Tommy spoke into his radio, his voice barely audible over the sound of settling debris. "The explosives went off early. The facility is collapsing, and I'm trapped down here with the bad guys." Static filled the radio for several terrifying seconds before Martinez's voice broke through. "Tommy, we're tracking seismic activity from your position. There should be an emergency exit tunnel marked with red paint near the main workstation. Follow it to the surface, but be careful. Our surveillance shows at least 3 hostiles still mobile in your area." Tommy gathered the research materials he had collected and searched frantically for the red markings that Martinez had described. The laboratory was larger than he had initially realized, with multiple workstations and equipment rooms branching off from the central area. Emergency power was failing, and Tommy's flashlight provided the only reliable illumination. The explosive device timer that the operatives had been carrying lay partially buried under fallen ceiling tiles, its digital display still counting down despite the earlier detonation. Tommy realized with growing horror that the timer showed 3 more minutes until a secondary explosion that would completely destroy whatever remained of the facility. Near Dr. Morrison's original workstation, Tommy found the red-painted tunnel entrance that Martinez had mentioned. But as he approached it, armed figures emerged from the shadows behind him. The foreign operatives had survived the initial collapse and were determined to complete their mission, even if it meant dying in the process. "Boy," one of them called out in heavily accented English, "give us the research materials and we will ensure you reach the surface safely." Tommy clutched the journal and storage devices tighter, remembering Frank's sacrifice and his father's years of dedication to protecting these secrets. "Why should I trust you? You just tried to blow us all up." The explosion was premature. We had planned to retrieve the materials before demolition. The lead operative stepped into Tommy's flashlight beam, revealing a man in his 40s with the bearing of a career soldier. "Doctor, Morrison's research belongs to the international scientific community, not to any single government. Then why are you destroying it instead of sharing it?" The operative's expression suggested that Tommy had asked a more complicated question than he realized. "Because some knowledge is too dangerous to exist, young man. Your government has kept this research secret for 70 years because they understand its potential for both creation and destruction." Tommy backed toward the emergency tunnel entrance, trying to keep the operatives in sight while feeling behind him for the escape route. His grandfather's lessons about dealing with dangerous predators had emphasized the importance of never turning your back on a threat, even when retreat was the only option. The timer on the explosive device now showed less than 2 minutes remaining, and the facility's emergency systems were broadcasting evacuation warnings in multiple languages. But the tunnel entrance appeared to be sealed by a blast door that required some kind of authorization code to open. "The door requires Dr. Morrison's personal access code," the operative observed, moving closer to Tommy's position. "A code that died with him in 1954, unless you know something that we do not." Tommy's mind raced as he tried to remember details from his father's documents and Frank's stories about the original research project. Then he remembered something that Frank had mentioned about Dr. Morrison's daughter, Catherine, who had married Frank and lived in Pine Ridge until her death. His grandfather's compass, which Tommy had been carrying since childhood, suddenly felt significant in a way he had never noticed before. The compass had belonged to his grandfather, but his grandfather had received it from Frank Kowalski as a wedding gift. Frank had received it from Catherine, and Catherine had inherited it from her father, Dr. Morrison. Tommy pulled out the compass and examined its back for the first time in years. Engraved in tiny numbers around the edge was a sequence that looked like it might be significant, 051954, representing the month and year that Project Mountain Shadow had officially ended. With 30 seconds remaining on the timer, Tommy entered the numbers into the blast door's access panel. The door slid open with a mechanical grinding sound, revealing an escape tunnel that led upward toward daylight and safety. Behind him, the operatives rushed forward, but Tommy was already running toward the surface with Dr. Morrison's research clutched against his chest and his grandfather's compass pointing the way home. Tommy emerged from the escape tunnel just as the secondary explosion rocked the mountainside, sending a column of smoke and debris into the morning sky. The research facility that had been hidden for 70 years was gone, reduced to rubble and memories that only a few people would ever fully understand. Agent Martinez and a team of government personnel were waiting at the tunnel exit, having tracked Tommy's position through the emergency radio system. The relief on their faces was obvious as Tommy handed over Dr. Morrison's research materials, but their celebration was cut short by the sound of gunfire echoing through the forest below. The foreign operatives who survived the collapse, Martinez explained, helping Tommy to his feet. They're making a final attempt to escape with whatever intelligence they can gather. We need to prevent them from reaching their extraction point. Tommy looked down at the forest, where he had spent countless hours learning to track game and read the signs that nature left for those who knew how to look. Now, those same skills were needed for a very different kind of hunt, one where the stakes extended far beyond a successful day in the wilderness. "I know these mountains better than anyone," Tommy said, pulling out his grandfather's compass and checking their position relative to the likely escape routes. "If they're trying to reach a helicopter pickup, there are only 3 places in this terrain where an aircraft can land safely." Martinez studied Tommy's confident expression and made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "Tommy, I'm going to ask you to do something dangerous. We need someone who can track their movement and guide our response teams to intercept them before they escape." The government agents were well trained and heavily equipped, but they moved through the mountain terrain like visitors in a foreign country. Tommy, on the other hand, flowed through the forest like water, finding its natural course, reading signs and interpreting sounds that the others couldn't even perceive. Following boot prints in soft earth and broken branches that marked the operative's passage, Tommy led the pursuit team through ravines and across ridgelines that didn't appear on any standard maps. His grandfather's compass proved invaluable for maintaining direction when the thick canopy blocked GPS signals and obscured landmarks. "They're heading for Eagle's Point," Tommy reported into his radio after examining disturbed moss and displaced stones along a game trail. "It's the only landing zone within hiking distance that can handle a helicopter." The chase through the wilderness became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Tommy's tracking skills proving to be the decisive advantage that Martinez's team needed. The foreign operatives were professional soldiers, but they were operating in terrain that Tommy had been exploring since he could walk. At a narrow crossing where Miller's Creek cut through a rocky gorge, Tommy spotted the opportunity that would end the pursuit. The operatives had to cross the creek at a specific point where fallen logs provided the only bridge across the rushing water. But Tommy knew a shortcut that would allow the government team to reach the crossing first. "Agent Martinez, if we circle around through Devil's Canyon, we can get ahead of them," Tommy explained, pointing out a route that would require climbing skills but would save crucial time. "They'll be trapped at the creek crossing with nowhere to run." The final confrontation took place in a setting that felt appropriate for the end of a mystery that had begun with a 12-year-old boy tracking deer through the same forest. As the foreign operatives approached the creek crossing, they found themselves surrounded by government agents who had positioned themselves using Tommy's intimate knowledge of the terrain. The lead operative, the same man who had tried to negotiate with Tommy in the collapsing laboratory, raised his hands in surrender but called out one final message across the water. "The boy has seen too much," he shouted to Agent Martinez. "Dr. Morrison's research was hidden for good reasons. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, regardless of which government controls it." Tommy felt the weight of that warning as he watched the operatives being taken into custody. He had saved the research materials and helped capture foreign agents, but the deeper questions about whether some secrets should remain buried would stay with him long after the excitement of the adventure had faded. His grandfather's compass had guided him through the most dangerous day of his life, but Tommy understood that it had also pointed him toward a future where the simple certainties of childhood would be replaced by the complex responsibilities of protecting knowledge that could change the world in ways both wonderful and terrible. As the government helicopters arrived to transport the prisoners and secure the remaining evidence, Tommy realized that his role in protecting his family's legacy was just beginning. 3 hours after the last foreign operative had been taken into custody, Tommy sat in Agent Martinez's temporary command center, reviewing documents that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about his family's history. The sealed orders from 1952 that Martinez had shown him contained information that even Frank Kowalski had never been told. "Your father wasn't just a security guard, Tommy," Martinez explained, opening a classified file that bore Michael Fletcher's name and photograph. "He was the designated successor to Dr. Morrison's research program. If the original facility had ever been compromised, your father was trained to continue the work at an alternate location." Tommy stared at technical diagrams and research notes that showed his father had possessed advanced degrees in nuclear physics and engineering, credentials that had been completely hidden from his family. The man Tommy remembered as a loving father who taught him to fish and hunt had actually been one of the country's leading experts on radioactive materials processing. The accident that killed him wasn't really an accident, Martinez continued carefully. He discovered that Edward Chen had been in contact with foreign agents for several years. When your father confronted him, Chen panicked and triggered an explosive device that was meant to destroy evidence of his betrayal. Sarah Fletcher entered the command center at that moment, her face showing the strain of the morning's events, but also a relief that came from knowing her son was safe. She had been debriefed separately about her own role in maintaining her husband's cover story, and now she could finally share the full truth with Tommy. "Your father made me promise to keep you away from all of this," she said, sitting beside Tommy and taking his hand. "He wanted you to have a choice about whether to continue his work, but I think recent events have made that decision for you." Agent Martinez spread out additional documents on the table, including building plans and technical specifications that showed the scope of the project that Tommy had unknowingly inherited. Dr. Morrison's research into clean energy production was decades ahead of its time. The materials you recovered from the facility could revolutionize power generation and eliminate dependence on fossil fuels. Tommy examined the technical drawings, trying to understand concepts that seemed to bridge the gap between science fiction and scientific reality. If this research is so important, why has it been kept secret for 70 years? Because the same technology that can provide unlimited clean energy can also be weaponized in ways that would make nuclear weapons look primitive, Martinez replied. Dr. Morrison understood that his discoveries needed to be protected until humanity was mature enough to use them responsibly. The weight of that responsibility settled on Tommy's shoulders as he realized that his simple adventure had connected him to decisions that could affect the future of human civilization. The choice to continue his father's work wasn't just about family honor anymore. It was about stewarding knowledge that could either save or destroy the world. "There's something else," Sarah said, producing a document that Tommy had never seen before. "Your father left specific instructions about what should happen if you ever discovered the truth about his work. He established a trust fund for your education and training, but only if you choose to accept the responsibilities that come with it." Tommy looked at the trust document, which outlined a comprehensive program of scientific and security training that would prepare him to understand and protect Dr. Morrison's research. The educational plan would take him to the finest universities in the country, but it would also require him to maintain the same level of secrecy that had defined his father's life. "I need to know something," Tommy said finally. "Jake Morrison, is he really related to Dr. Morrison?" Martinez nodded. "Dr. Morrison's grandson. The Morrison family was relocated to California after the project ended, but when Jake's father decided to move back to Montana, we arranged for them to settle in Pine Ridge, where we could keep an eye on them. Does Jake know? Not yet. But if you decide to accept your father's legacy, Jake will be offered the same opportunity. Dr. Morrison always intended for family members to work together on continuing his research." Tommy thought about his best friend who had shared the adventure and the dangers without ever knowing that his own family history was intimately connected to the secrets they had uncovered. The decision about whether to reveal Jake's heritage would be another responsibility that came with accepting his father's work. Outside the command center, helicopters were arriving to transport the recovered research materials to secure facilities where they would be studied and protected by the next generation of scientists. Tommy understood that whatever choice he made about his future would determine whether Dr. Morrison's legacy would finally be shared with the world or remain hidden for another 70 years. 6 months after the events at the hidden research facility, Tommy Fletcher stood in a classroom that looked nothing like the simple schoolhouse where his mother taught 3rd grade. The specialized training facility hidden within the University of Montana's physics department represented the beginning of an educational journey that would prepare him for responsibilities he was still learning to understand. Agent Martinez had become something between a teacher and a guardian, overseeing Tommy's introduction to concepts that bridged advanced science with national security. The curriculum included everything from nuclear physics to wilderness survival, acknowledging that protecting Dr. Morrison's legacy would require both intellectual and practical skills. Today we're going to discuss energy cascade theory, Martinez said, pulling up diagrams that showed how Dr. Morrison's research could potentially provide unlimited clean power. Your father understood these concepts well enough to continue the research if necessary. Now it's your turn to master them. Tommy wore a junior security badge that granted him access to classified materials, but also marked him as someone whose every movement was monitored and protected. The badge represented both privilege and burden, connecting him to a legacy that he was still deciding whether to fully embrace. Jake Morrison sat at the desk beside Tommy, his own junior security badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The revelation about his family connection to Dr. Morrison had been overwhelming initially, but Jake had adapted to the new reality with the same analytical thinking that had made him such a valuable partner in their original investigation. The cascade equations are similar to what my great-grandfather was working on, Jake observed, studying the technical diagrams with growing comprehension. But these modifications suggest applications that go far beyond energy production. Martinez nodded approvingly. Dr. Morrison's final research dealt with fundamental questions about the nature of matter and energy. The potential applications include everything from medical treatments to space exploration, but also weapons systems that could destabilize global politics. Tommy raised his hand, a gesture that still felt strange in this environment where he was treated more like a colleague than a student. Agent Martinez, how do we decide when the world is ready for this kind of technology? That's the question your father struggled with for 15 years, Martinez replied. He believed that the decision should never rest with any single person or government. Dr. Morrison's research belongs to humanity, but it needs to be released gradually and responsibly. The training program included regular field exercises that took Tommy and Jake back into the Montana wilderness, now as junior guardians of sites that contained backup research facilities and emergency supply caches. Tommy's natural wilderness skills had been enhanced with military-style training, while Jake's analytical abilities had been developed through advanced scientific education. During one of these exercises, Tommy and Jake discovered that they weren't the only young people being prepared for roles in protecting classified research. Students from around the country, all connected to various Cold War projects, were being trained in similar programs that balanced scientific education with security responsibilities. It's like a secret society, Jake observed during a break between training sessions, except instead of silly rituals, we're learning to protect knowledge that could change civilization. Tommy's relationship with his mother had evolved as well. Sarah Fletcher now served as the community liaison for Pine Ridge, helping to maintain the cover stories that protected the area's continued role in housing classified operations. She had embraced her husband's legacy in ways that went beyond simply keeping his secrets. Frank Kowalski's sacrifice had been officially recognized within the intelligence community, and a memorial in his honor had been established at the training facility. Tommy visited it regularly, drawing inspiration from Frank's example of ordinary people accepting extraordinary responsibilities. The junior security badge that Tommy wore came with privileges that extended beyond access to classified materials. He had been given authority to recruit other young people whose skills and character suggested they might be valuable additions to the program that was being built around Dr. Morrison's legacy. Agent Martinez, Tommy said during one of their regular evaluation sessions, I want to expand the program to include more local kids. There are others in Pine Ridge who have the skills and judgment to help protect these secrets. Martinez smiled, recognizing that Tommy was beginning to think like a leader rather than simply a student. That's exactly the kind of initiative your father would have shown. Dr. Morrison always believed that protecting his research would require building communities of trust, not just individual guardians. As Tommy looked out the classroom window at the Montana mountains that had shaped his childhood and changed his destiny, he understood that he was becoming something his 12-year-old self could never have imagined, a bridge between the secrets of the past and the possibilities of the future. 2 years had passed since Tommy Fletcher first stumbled upon the abandoned railroad that changed his life forever. Now 14, he sat at the same kitchen table where his mother graded papers, but instead of homework, he was writing in a new journal that would record his experiences for future generations of guardians. The Pine Ridge community had evolved in subtle but significant ways since the truth about their area's strategic importance had been partially revealed. New families had moved to town, all carefully vetted and connected to the expanding network that protected Dr. Morrison's research legacy. The town's children grew up with a deeper understanding of their responsibility to preserve secrets that could shape humanity's future. Jake Morrison, now Tommy's official partner in the Guardian program, helped maintain the cover stories that allowed their work to continue without attracting unwanted attention. Their friendship had deepened through shared dangers and responsibilities that few people their age could comprehend. "Remember, when our biggest worry was whether we'd catch any fish at Silver Lake," Jake said, looking up from the technical manual he was studying. His expertise in Dr. Morrison's energy cascade theory had progressed to the point where he was contributing original research to the project. Tommy smiled, remembering the simplicity of their childhood adventures before they became entangled in international conspiracies and family legacies. "Sometimes I miss not knowing about any of this, but I think we're doing something important here." Sarah Fletcher entered the kitchen carrying a letter that bore official government seals, the kind of correspondence that had become routine in their household. "Agent Martinez wants to meet with you boys tomorrow. Apparently, there's been another discovery." The discovery turned out to be a network of similar research facilities that Dr. Morrison had established across the western United States, each one hidden and protected by families whose children were now being recruited into the Guardian program. Tommy and Jake's success in Pine Ridge had become a model for expanding the protection network nationwide. "Your father would be proud," Agent Martinez told Tommy during their meeting at the training facility. The program he helped design is now protecting research sites in 12 states, all staffed by young people who understand the importance of balancing scientific progress with responsible stewardship. Tommy looked out at a group of teenage guardians conducting training exercises in the Montana wilderness, their skills combining traditional outdoor competencies with advanced technical knowledge. Each of them carried the same kind of responsibility that had been thrust upon him when he first found the railroad, but now they were part of a coordinated effort that gave their individual sacrifices greater meaning. The railroad site itself had been transformed into a memorial and training ground where new guardians learned about the history they were protecting. The locomotive and train cars had been restored and maintained as monuments to the courage of people like Frank Kowalski and Tommy's father, who had given their lives to preserve Dr. Morrison's legacy. "I've been thinking about the future," Tommy said to Jake as they walked through the memorial site. "About when we'll be old enough to make decisions about releasing Dr. Morrison's research to the world." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "My great-grandfather always believed that scientific knowledge belonged to humanity, but he also understood that timing matters. Maybe our generation will finally be wise enough to use his discoveries responsibly." Tommy opened his new journal to a fresh page and began writing the entry that would conclude his record of the events that had transformed a simple mountain boy into a guardian of secrets that could change the world. "Day 847 since discovering the railroad," he wrote. "Today I understand that some adventures never really end. They just evolve into responsibilities that define who we become." The 12-year-old boy who found those rusty tracks couldn't have imagined the path that discovery would open, but I'm grateful that curiosity led me to a purpose larger than myself. As the sun set over the Montana mountains that had shaped his childhood and defined his destiny, Tommy Fletcher continued writing, documenting experiences that future guardians would need to understand. His grandfather's compass sat on the table beside the journal, still pointing true north, still guiding the next generation toward responsibilities that would preserve hope for humanity's future. The abandoned railroad that had started it all was no longer abandoned. It had become the foundation for a network of protection that stretched across the continent, staffed by young people who understood that some secrets were worth keeping until the world was ready to receive them safely. Tommy closed the journal and looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to honor the legacy he had inherited from his father and the mountain community that had shaped him into someone capable of protecting the future.